Hello and welcome to episode 43 of the Wilder podcast. This week we speak with Ben Goldsmith about rewilding his family farm in memory of his daughter, the hope offered by global rewilding projects, and how nature credits could fund large-scale restoration. Chloe, hello.
Hello, Tom.
Shall we do that British thing about starting off by talking about the weather?
Well, it has been the subject of a lot of conversations over the last few weeks.
I feel like maybe if someone's listening to this in a year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years time, they'll look back at this, and I hope this will be a one-off kind of drought situation that hasn't been repeated regularly, because it's terrifying what's happening to the land at the moment, isn't it?
I was reflecting yesterday, and I think this is the difference when you are living on a landscape in a very intimate way and also growing food on a landscape, you become a lot more attuned to weather conditions, and you can see why farmers only talk about weather.
Yeah.
Because we have literally had, I can probably count on one hand the number of days of significant rain we've had since February.
It's crazy.
And the land is really showing that.
Yeah. And we can talk about that probably in more detail in a second. But I am aware that we haven't kept with tradition and we don't stop. We normally start off each podcast, or if you are new to listening to the Wilder podcast, welcome. And we always start with a little bit of a recap about who we are and what we're doing. So, Chloe, whose turn is it?
It's always your turn, Tom.
Is it? Okay.
You just do such a better job than I do.
I don't know. I just might record that and play back to me when I feel sad. Okay. So we are Chloe and Tom, husband and wife, and we have been restoring nature back to our 80-acre site in Monmouthshire for the last 2 years or so. And the whole point is this podcast is documenting our journey. It actually started about 6.5 years ago at the birth of our first child. We've now got 3 of the little ankle biters. And we just thought we'd find out whether or not, climate change was actually a thing. That's how naive we were back then. And we've gone on a journey once we've opened Pandora's box about climate change, biodiversity, lost plastics, and all the other challenges we've got facing our country and Earth. And we thought we'd do something about it. So we're now documenting our journey. We've got the farm here at the Grange Project, and we're using this podcast to talk about our project a little bit, but also interview amazing guests each episode as we go through our journey and we educate ourselves. So we're learning, hopefully you're learning, and we're all progressing and hopefully driving some change together.
So back to the weather.
Okay.
Good job.
Okay, thanks. In terms of the weather and the land, so how is it affecting our site? Clearly, it's on clay, so the land is cracking and it's rock hard. The scrapes I dug last year that stayed wet all year long, which is where the pigs had their wallow, that dried up months ago. There's a stream or spring that originates on our land that normally is a kind of babbling brook, but a good stream that is on the verge of drying out, which is very, very sad. Sad for our livestock, because then clearly we're going to have to then create a solution to ensure they've got their water. Sad, I'm sure, for all the wildlife that's using that stream.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the kind of landscape, people keep comparing the Grange Hub, which is our new education and engagement centre, to some sort of safari lodge, which is a lovely compliment, except what they're talking about is the fact it looks like an African savannah over the grassland, and it's so dry, so brown. Like, I guess we're lucky in that we do have those deep roots of the grass, so there is at least something to help protect and cover the soil from being baked. But I know a lot of people farming don't necessarily have that choice or option to have those standing crops in for such a long time. So I think we really need to consider at a regional, national scale how we are going to respond and adapt to these changing climatic patterns to ensure that we are protecting the soil and the animals that, I watch these poor herds of sheep and horses and cattle trying to find any inch of shade they can in the parched landscape, and really thinking about agroforestry and how we need to plant more trees in our farming systems to give livestock the best chance of tolerating these unprecedented weather conditions.
Before we go on to talk about some final bits and bobs on the Grange Project and go into the great conversation we've got today, I do want to say we had our borehole stop working as well, which, we're off mains water. We've got a borehole here. The engineer that came out, I was talking to him about these challenging kind of water levels, and he was talking about it's not too bad at the moment, but his point is that obviously over the winter, when hopefully those levels in the aquifers rise again, they're not rising to the previous levels. So then we have another drought and it drops down further, and then we have the water and it goes up slightly high, but still not to the same levels as the year before. And so it's slowly dropping down. level by level. And that's something to worry about. God, this is doom and gloom.
For to say, a little bit depressed.
Oh my goodness! I apologise. This is not the normal doom and gloom, but it is. The weather affects us, isn't it?
Can I do a segue into a positive story?
Go on, mate.
Okay, so there are two positive things happening in September that are kind of connected to our conversation around weather, but perhaps provide a kind of hopeful way forward with them. So we are offering 2 courses in September from the Grange Project. One is on the theme of scything, and the nice thing about the grass being really dry is it's going to be easy to scythe.
This is true.
So people sometimes ask me, well, what is scything and what is a scythe? And I do not profess to be an expert in the process of scything, but what I do understand is it's a really meditative and engaging way to manage grassland, and we're going to be using this process to manage our wood meadow, which is very exciting, and we're going to be training 6 wonderful people to be able to use this ancient tool, which the lovely thing about it is there's no fossil fuels burned in the making of the cut in the grassland, and you can also work with the landscape. So if you see something that looks really special, or a habitat or a vole's nest, you can work your way around it, as well as it being a nice workout and a way of kind of connecting in silence with nature.
Because of the slow pace, it gives wildlife the opportunity to scurry away into the hedgerows or whatever it might be. So you're not just basically terraforming the whole area very, very quickly, very rapidly. All the bugs and insects get an opportunity to move away.
Absolutely. So the date of that course is the 11th of September, and we have 1 space remaining. So if you're interested in that place, fully catered, and the chance to experience the Grange Project, then please reach out to us at hello@grangeproject.co.uk.
Mm-hmm.
So the second course is very apt because the theme of it is climate resilient gardening. And it's essentially, how do we grow vegetables primarily in this ever-changing climatic conditions? So we're looking at everything from planting plans, chemical-free pest management, how you maintain water and habitat on your polyculture planting system, no-dig methods, composting, everything you need to be able to manage your garden of any size, given the increasing temperatures and utilising natural processes.
That's a very interesting phrase you used. I wouldn't expect that from a rewilder. Pests indeed. Wildlife. Is it?
Gosh, having picked off about 1,000,000 trillion caterpillars off my brassicas this summer, I would describe them as a pest in certain contexts.
Interesting. Okay. Well, but I what I do know is that the lady is extremely knowledgeable, and it will be a great course. So again, ping us an email if that is relevant to you.
20th of September, lunch included. We'll throw in a tour of the project if you're interested, and it would be lovely to see lots of people coming together and learning how to grow excellent veg in sometimes challenging conditions.
Got to say, the sweet corn that we had off the market garden recently was unbelievable. But I digress. Right, looks like it's time to get into the conversation today. This is another one of those conversations we've been looking forward to. It's been a long time coming, and Ben's been very kind and given us a lot of time and opportunity to get the right conversation done. And I think this is the right chat. He's very open. He shares amazing stories about his life, his connection to nature, and quite intimate stories about the loss of his daughter and how that inspired him to rewild his own farm where he's at. We cover other things, but as part of it, a big bit of it is talking about the business element to it and the natural capital. And I think it's an area we haven't really covered in a lot of detail up until now. So it's been fascinating to hear his perspective, and he so eloquently articulates his perspective on it that it's very, very compelling.
I think the phrase force of nature gets bandied around a bit, but I would say that Ben might be one of those people that phrase could apply to.
Yeah, but not in like a aggressive tornado force of nature perspective. I would kind of define him as extremely. It's just his pure eloquence and intelligence when articulating a logical argument that leaves you in a position where you're like, yeah, makes sense. So anyway, without further ado, this is our conversation with Ben Goldsmith. I hope you enjoy. Ben, welcome to the Wilder podcast.
Thank you both, Tom and Chloe, for having me on. It's a great pleasure.
The pleasure's ours, and I won't talk about the technical issues that we had podcast up to podcast on the last episode that we tried to interview you and it all went wrong, horribly wrong from our side. So I do apologise for that.
No, it suited me very well. It was a sunny day, and your technical issues translated for me into a 45-minute swim in my pond with one of my kids. So I was delighted. And here we are again 2 weeks later. So it worked out well.
Perfect. For those that may not have come across you, or indeed your background, your podcast, would you mind giving us a bit of an introduction about yourself and what you find yourself doing now?
Yeah, it's quite funny that you called me a podcaster. I hadn't really thought of it like that. I mean, I've been passionate about nature and wildlife for my whole life since my earliest memories, and I was interested in rewilding before it was even a term. You know, I've got letters in my desk with kind of the guy that ran Richmond Park when I was 11 years old, and I wrote to him and said, "Why can't we have wild boar back in the park?" And that's where I grew up. Got a very lovely and patient reply from the guy. And today I do this podcast to highlight some of the most exciting rewilding projects around the world. I mean, there's just so much happening, and people are generally enthusiastic about nature and nature restoration, but they don't know. They don't know that there's a rewilding project the size of Germany happening on the Golden Steppe, the great grasslands of Kazakhstan, where the numbers of saiga antelope are up from 30,000 20 odd years ago to nearly 4 million today. And they're putting back wild ass and a wolf. Numbers have recovered, and beavers are back, and they're looking at which species of bison is most appropriate there. And their ultimate goal is to restore cheetahs to Central Asia. That similar kind of projects in Namibia or in Montana. And then there's wonderful things happening at a smaller, more local level. I co-chaired the Rewilding London Task Force for Sadiq Khan. And there are these innumerable projects, often volunteer run, across the capital city in which I live most of the time, in which streets and patches of wild nature are being restored throughout the fabric of the built environment. And so I set up a podcast called Rewilding the World to highlight those stories and bring people a dose of optimism. And aside from that, I've worked in green investment during my working life the last 20 odd years, initially kind of renewables and electrification of transport and water and waste and all those things, and more recently in natural capital, because we need to mobilize similar amounts of private finance into nature if we're going to restore nature at the scale that it needs to happen. So in the last couple of years, there's been a coalescence of my love of nature and wildlife and my experience as an investment manager. So those are the things that I'm doing.
Well, as a listener to your podcast, I have to say I find it so inspirational just hearing about that global picture, because it's so easy to get caught up in a very localized view. But then there are also some fantastic episodes that have been really relevant for our journey, like I'm thinking about with Jonathan Thomas with Underhill Nature Reserve, which is that small scale rewilding that shows how quickly nature can return to, less than 50 acres as well, which is amazing.
Yeah, I had a guy called James Canton on the podcast. I don't think the episode's quite out yet. And he's a teacher and an author, and he's just written a book called Renaturing. He's got 2 acres behind his place in Essex, and he's been restoring nature there in quite a hands-on way. I mean, he bought himself a scythe to kind of mimic the behavior of wild grazers on his 2-acre plot, and a handsaw, and the place is just booming with life, from what I can tell. And yeah, I'm not fussy about the definition of this term rewilding. It doesn't need to be millions of acres in northern Montana with plains bison and grizzly bears. I think if you're living on the kind of 30th floor of a tower block, and you've got a window box and you want to put native wildflowers in the window box and attract in native pollinators to greet you when you come home from work, I think that's rewilding. And so large and small, there are lots of great things happening, but it is going to cost money, to rewild in the way that we need. We're not going to fix the climate problem without nature. We need to fix nature if we are to draw massive amounts of greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere and lock them away again. And we need to fix nature for a whole host of other reasons. And we need to raise private finance to do that in one way or another, because it does cost money.
Yeah, and that's definitely the kind of the second half of this conversation. I also want to reflect on the fact you can tell that you're used to interviewing people, because you've managed to bullseye pretty much all of my initial questions in your first introduction and so eloquently answer them that I'm now kind of scrabbling for the next page of notes that I've written down. But we're well aware that you also have your own personal rewilding project at home. So would you mind giving us a bit more about that? How long you've been doing it for, and where have you drawn the inspiration for that from?
As a child, if you'd come into the back garden where I grew up, you'd have found me and my older brother building hedgehog houses and trying to dig ponds. It was very sandy in Richmond, West London, where we grew up. So none of our ponds ever worked. We tried everything, including plastic liners and all sorts of things, putting up bird boxes. I mean, I've been in love with nature and wildlife forever. And I actually remember sitting next to a nice lady at one of my mum's kind of lunches, and she said, "Oh, you're the one that loves nature," as if it was kind of like stamp collecting or something. And I remember thinking that's slightly odd, but I had a lovely conversation with her. But I remember thinking it's more than a hobby. This is something that is everything for me. My dream was to have a bit of land somewhere that I could restore nature on. I didn't quite know what that would mean. And my father died when I was young, so I inherited some money. And the very first thing I did after I got married in my early 20s and had my first couple of kids was to buy myself a little farm in South Somerset, which is home. It's the only property I own. And my wife and I work in London, so we rent a place in London. This is really where my roots are and where my heart is. And we've added bits and pieces to that over time. And when I first got here, I sort of thought, well, trees are nature. What you do is you plant some trees. So I applied for a woodland grant from the Forestry Commission and planted about 20 acres of woodland with mixed native species, dug out a couple of ponds at the edge of those woods. And the rest of the farm, we continued to farm in the way that you're meant to. With 60 Dorset pole sheep, 50 white part cattle, tractor, barbed wire fences, costs and losses, subsidies to mask the losses, and a farm that, because we're on heavy clay in the old Selwood Forest area, an area that was never really deemed suitable for farming in the past. Now, if you look at the old maps earlier than, say, 1830, 1840, this whole area was described as manorial wastes. Areas where the lords of the manor didn't deem it worth farming, so local people could turn out their cattle and their pigs and cut turf and collect honey and fruit and all that kind of stuff. So this is not good farmland. So in the fields here, when we were farming it properly, it was kind of the battle of the Somme of mud for 6-7 months of the year and baked concrete for the other few months of the year. And we spent all our time in the area that we planted with trees and where the 2 ponds were. That was sort of our life. Me with 3 little kids and my first wife, Kate. And then the unimaginable happened in July 2019, and my daughter Iris, age 15 and a half, was home for a few days and messing about on a farm vehicle, turned it over on herself and was killed. Every parent's worst nightmare. The kind of, I just can't describe well in words, the darkness that settles over you when that happens. How can such a thing possibly happen? The injustice, the rage, the misery, the despair. And I guess what I noticed in that's 6 years ago now, and I noticed almost immediately, that the beauty of the world wasn't lost on me. And it sounds so odd, but I remember walking around in a kind of daze, and there's this awful feeling when you're going through terrible grief and something like that's happened, a feeling of waiting. I think it was C.S. Lewis said it's like waiting. There's nothing to wait for, but it feels like this awful waiting for something to happen. And nothing, of course, is going to happen. It's done. There's no going back. Kind of fear. I think it was Joan Didion who said it's like fear, like a kind of waiting, an anxiety. And what I found is that the moments of relief were associated with nature. A cup of tea in my hands in the morning. It was summertime. The kind of morning sun coming through the canopy of the trees, the birds singing, the flowers. I remember sitting there thinking, okay, for a moment, I just feel okay, briefly. And then I discovered swimming in my pond at the bottom of the valley. And I realized that just being in the water gave me a moment of relief from that anxiety, that fear. I think there's something about being in water is helpful in any case, but it was something about the nature all around me, the little dragonflies darting on the surface of the water and the shafts of sunlight and the birds above my head and just this gentle, benevolent hum of nature all around made me feel okay, for a moment. It was like I was kind of held. And I started to realize that my hobby, hadn't been a hobby. It had been something that we all deeply and viscerally need, always, not just in times of great hardship, but always. We need connection with nature. It's there for us and it holds us when we need it most. And I knew at that moment that my wonderings as to whether I could stay in this place where Iris had died, were completely wrong. My survival would depend upon me staying here. So we decided, particularly my 2 little sons and I, who at the time were 13 and 11, we're going to rewild this place. It's what Iris would have loved. She was a little wild child with auburn hair who loved nature, who ran around all day long on her little pony with her friends out in the wild places of the farm, wilder corners. I gave her an iPhone. I shouldn't have done. I mean, with my new older children, they will not get an iPhone at the age Iris had one. But she sent me this video that means a great deal to me, which I'm going to show you. And anyone listening will be able to hear the awe and excitement in her voice at seeing a flock of starlings go up in the air around her.
Look, Dad, I'm right by the songs. I'll get inside. And later going up. Look how giant that is. I was right next to him.
Wow. So that's a 12, 13-year-old Iris, breathless with excitement on her own to see a murmuration of starlings go up. So we decided, the boys and I, that we would stop this farming. And as it happens, the government had ended basic payments a few years earlier, and it was very obvious that this was never going to be a kind of profitable or successful food-producing venture, cattle and sheep on a piece of South Somerset clay. And so we just got to work. I sent the sheep off, sent the cattle off. We got diggers out. We pulled out the fencing like spaghetti. And then behind one row of barbed wire, there was another older fence. Behind that, some grandfather fence rotting away, and hauled it all out. And we ran a mole plough over the fields and heard the popping of the field drains underneath. And we blocked up the ditches. And then we just watched as nature unfurled in the most extraordinarily dramatic way during the last 5 years. So pockets of dog rose and blackthorn and crabapple popping up through the middle of the fields, and bramble cushions, and the hedges spilling out sideways, and hockey stick increases in all kinds of species, and new species appearing here that weren't here before. And we have a pair of beavers and their offspring, which have transformed the bottom of the valley into a string of, I don't know, Japanese rice terraces, like a beautiful sunlit wetland. And we have great egrets in there and kingfishers. Up on the hill where we had some conifers that we removed as part of the rewilding, we have nightjars and goshawks, and it's just, this place sings with life now. And so to answer your question, the inspiration to really unleash nature on our farm and prioritize this wilder approach was a kind of love letter to my daughter Iris. She would have loved it, and I feel her here, and I'm devoted to this now in every corner of my life. And that's why my professional life has gone from being more of a mainstream green investor to being one totally focused on natural capital and unlocking finance for rewilding, because I'd like to see what's happening here in South Somerset happen all over the place.
And I just want to offer some appreciation, Ben, because having been through the unimaginable and, speaking as their parents ourselves, I can't begin to contemplate what that would have been like. But you turn that tragedy into something so beautiful, not just in what you just eloquently described with the rewilding of the farm, but also in a fabulous book, God is an Octopus. I would really recommend anyone to get hold of it, because it is an extension of that love letter in articulating something, a journey that has so many connections and philosophical questions and beautiful descriptions of wilderness. So thank you because I'm sure that the ripple effect of that and the many other things that I know that you've done in celebration of Iris's life with the charitable work, and there's so much that has come from that terrible tragedy.
It's very kind of you to say. I mean, I was always planning on writing a book that was going to be a kind of roadmap, as I saw it, for rewilding in Britain. I've thought about these things for a long, long time and care deeply about them. I'm no expert. I'm just a great kind of enthusiast and I'm a sort of mad nature lover. And I wanted to write a book that would describe how I saw it, this kind of pathway of the things that we need to do, restoring rivers, removing blockages such as dams and weirs, and reintroducing missing species and so on. And then I sat down to write that story, and it was immediately obvious to me that this needed to be a personal story. It was a year and a half after Iris died, and I sat at a laptop computer in the middle of that big lockdown, whiskey in my hand, and immediately the words started coming out, about what had happened and why I feel the way I do. So I had never intended to write such a personal book, and it's quite strange bumping into people who I've never met before, who have read my book, and they're kind of been in my head, a year of my thoughts in a book, and it's quite a strange thing.
One thing I'm curious about, Ben, I'm a psychologist and I research nature connection and particularly ecological identity. And I can hear in your passion that innate connection with nature that is shared by you and your family. And I suppose I wondered, we were trying to develop that in other young people. We're trying to work out how to increase nature connection as someone's core of themselves. And I wonder what do you think's led to you having that connection in a way that other people just aren't even aware of nature as part of their story or their understanding?
I think all children are born with an innate fascination for nature or the non-human world. I think E.O. Wilson was the writer who coined the term biophilia, to describe that. We love our dogs, and we yearn for connection on some level. And I think it's front and center in the early years of our life. Anyone who's played with a toddler outdoors and lifted up a piece of York stone to look at the woodlice and the slugs underneath, or who's seen frogs mating in the edge of a pond in February, or found birds' nests with blue eggs in, and that children they're completely awestruck by these things. They want to spend their whole day interacting with the real world, with nature. And I think as we grow up in the culture that we've got, I think that falls somewhat dormant in most people. I don't think it goes away. I think it's still there. I mean, look at a London park when the sun comes out. Everyone's there, sitting on the grass, facing in the sun. Look at the prices of apartments which overlook the park versus those that don't. Now, I think the yearning is there. And what is it that makes it fall dormant? Well, in my case, I think I had adults around me that normalized this idea of nature as a central part of our life and our identity. Mm-hmm. And my brother-in-law, who I adore and who was a huge figure in my teenage life, is Imran Khan. My sister Jemima left Bristol University at the age of 19 and married the retiring captain of the Pakistan cricket team, some 25 years her senior. And my parents were slightly nervous as she disappeared off to Lahore and had 2 sons. And ultimately the marriage only lasted 10 years, but she remains very close with him. But he was there as this awesome, inspirational figure permanently in my life during the first few years of their marriage. The whole summer they spent in where we were growing up. My father had died when I was a teenager, and he would just throw into conversation, "Oh, thank God for the gift of fragrance, smelling flowers," or do stop talking for a moment so we can listen to the bird song. Nature is just central for him. And so I think there were people like that. My brother Zach, was a little bit of a dorky teenager, older than me, with a kind of Save the Hedgehog t-shirt on. Was endlessly rescuing little birds that had fallen out of their nests, and a whole day would be occupied with creating habitat for them, and some kind of cigar box with sort of little makeshift nest inside, and he had mice in his pockets at boarding school. So I was surrounded by older people who I loved and respected, for whom nature was central. And so for me, it never went dormant. Maybe it would have done if I'd been in a different family. But I think the key is just good experiences in nature. I don't think it's necessarily about learning the names of the species or understanding in great detail those interactions. Now, nature, of course, is just innumerable patterns overlaid on patterns, all these interactions between different species, and we can never understand it in all its complexity and all its wonder. But what we can do is feel it. And I think getting children out in kind of forest school setting, and getting them to have a fun afternoon, making balls with the mud at the edge of the river and chucking the balls into the water and splashing about and picking things and collecting things and just having fun. I think a single afternoon of that is enough to stay with you forever. I know children of my friends who've been to stay here in Somerset who are devoted to nature, absolutely devoted, and all they've done is have a bit of a good time here in a place that is becoming increasingly wild. And I haven't taught them very much. I organise stuff outside. We will spend the afternoon, everyone, at the edge of this pond, out with a rug, a little bit of a picnic, and just mess about. I think that's enough. So I think we need it to be part of the school curriculum. I think things like pupil premium funding, shouldn't be ring-fenced for activities within the classroom. Mm-hmm. I think children from disadvantaged backgrounds in inner city schools should be funded by the taxpayer to get out into nature on a regular basis. In Sweden or Norway, that's very normal. Kids go off into nature for weeks at a time. So I think you've asked a question which points to, for me, one of the most important challenges of our time is how do we create individual and collective reconnection with nature? And society's ready for it. We're going through a cultural shift at the moment, I think.
Well, I completely agree with you, Ben. And actually, all of what you say completely reflects the research findings. And that's exactly the focus of our charity here, is reconnecting that adolescent age group with nature, trying to awaken the dormant innate connection. And we're excited to see what comes from bringing young people here and watching how they explore and rediscover the space.
They say that you want to build a bank of love for nature in children as they approach their teenage years. And then inevitably, it will fall into the background for a period of time, while they focus on other things, let's say. And then as they reach their late teens and early 20s, they then come back to it. So what's really important is to establish the foundational love and connection in those early years before teens.
Mm-hmm. As part of Chloe's research, and Chloe, please correct me if I get this wrong, but one of the main focuses for us is at those ages where they're slightly more disconnected or it goes dormant, they're making life decisions. Where do you study at university? What jobs do you want to go and do? And so we're really, really keen to try and make sure that even if it's dormant, it's still a thought process in the background to enable and ensure the next generation has a bit of a focus on nature.
And I think, as you articulated in the book, Ben, and even in the passion that you're describing here, there is so much joy to be found in this relationship. Like it's a lifelong relationship. You can have it anywhere, and the resource it brings for your well-being and for planetary well-being is completely unquestionable.
Yeah, I've helped. A group of us have loosely been of support to a guy called Anthony Rawlins, who's launched in the last couple of weeks an app called Rewilding. Mm-hmm. And the idea, I guess, it's kind of like a timeout or a kind of what are those travel apps we use, but for nature. So you find yourself in Doncaster, you go on the app and it says, here are some nature places within reach of you now. You know, there's a wetland over here in our RSPB reserve or what have you. And then you can engage with that place through the app. So the idea is to create a kind of nature app. And I think it's a really interesting idea. And that's why I've, in a very peripheral sense, got involved in that. Because I think making it easy for people to access nature is a key part of the challenge. I think people are intimidated. You know, they've never been bird watching. They don't have the kit, the binoculars. They don't know the names of the birds. They don't have, you know, the right footwear or whatever, and they just don't think of it. But if there was an app that makes it really easy, you just park here and go for a walk there, and you'll see some cool stuff. You know, I think it could unlock access to nature for a lot of people. But the bigger problem, I think, is that we don't have much nature left in this country. You know, we think we do. You know, you go on your Instagram and see where your friends are this summer, and you'll have friends in utterly overgrazed uplands in Wales or in the Pennines or in Scotland, and they'll think, well, they post a picture, look, I can see a long way, and my mobile reception is scant, so this must be a wild place. But they don't realize they're in landscapes that are utterly depleted by overgrazing, whether it's deer or sheep, and deforestation followed by overgrazing. And people don't understand, or they'll photograph themselves in a monoculture of Sitka spruce, and they think they're in a woodland. So we've lost touch with nature partly because we don't have much of it left. And that's why this habitat recreation that's taking place all over the British Isles and beyond is so exciting. Now, I'm sitting in this place in Somerset here where 7 neighbours are all rewilding their land in one way or another. You know, and then there's forests connected to us with 6,000 acres of what was previously coniferous monoculture that has been restored back to mixed deciduous woodland. So we've got thousands of acres of habitat being restored here. And there are similar ink blots of nature recovery happening all over the country now, many of them supported by the government's new landscape recovery programme. We live in a very exciting time for nature creation.
I like that phrase, ink blot. It's a military term that was used during the Malayan emergency, where as you're fighting counterinsurgency, you have to create ink spot effects in order for the ink to spread, in order to keep control of an area. And I think that's a good analogy for nature fighting back and starting to spread. I feel like 2 things. Firstly, Ben, I don't know if you, but Chloe and I have found ourselves at dinner parties being the people who are now trying to how to articulate that to your friends and neighbours, saying when they go on those nice holidays, trying to explain to them, no, that's nature depleted areas, and actually there's other places you could go. That's a challenge. But also, I feel like we're getting halfway through this chat now, and I think we should flip over to the second half of this conversation, as long as everyone's in agreement, onto nature credits. Does that sound like a good time?
Sure. I mean, just to answer that point about reading the room, you know, I think there are different ways of talking about these things with different people. You know, if people have well-entrenched ways of understanding and doing things, if you come in a combative frame of mind and criticize them for the way they have done things all their life and maybe the way their family has done things for generations, they'll only get further entrenched. So I think a spirit of kind of friendship and understanding is probably, even though it doesn't necessarily come to mind first, you know, often we feel quite angry. You know, often if you love nature and you see it being destroyed all around you by people doing all kinds of terrible things to it, the immediate reaction is often anger. Now, how can you possibly want to do that to that river? How can you want to dump that stuff on your land or whatever it is? But that's not necessarily the right way to go about it. And I think the return of beavers to Britain is a really interesting case study in this. You know, initial fury on the part of land managers, landowners, you know, kind of traditional interests in the countryside, even if the public were very excited about the return of beavers to Britain. And now it's almost quaint when you come across someone who's anti-beavers in the countryside. You know, there are certain instances of very niche examples of where beavers are a nuisance and need some kind of management. But for the most part, they're not really a nuisance. It's a different kind of ecosystem that you could describe as a mess. But it's a question of interpretation. And they bring so many benefits in terms of holding water in the landscape and breathing life back into nature. And I think most people understand this. I was with a big commercial arable farmer in Wiltshire 2 weeks ago. The guy produces 14,000 tons of grain every year. And the beavers have so enthused him on his stretch of the River Wylye that he and his neighbours have secured a landscape recovery grant, and they're restoring 2 or 3 miles of the River Wylye and creating reconnection with floodplain meadows and restoring wetlands and doing a really lovely rewilding project down the middle of his farm. I don't know what this guy's attitudes on beavers were 4 or 5 years ago, but I would bet my good money it was anti. So I think if we handle things right and the messaging is gentle and in a spirit of friendship, I think we can win people over.
And then I think nature does the hard work for us. Like you said, he's been enthused by that experience. And that's what we need to get people connected. They can see what happens. They can see the joy it brings. And then it's like a runaway train, I think. It feels like we're on a cusp of that.
We recently opened the Grange hub here, Ben, and we had our neighbours, our farmers that came for the first time and saw this land in a different way, shall we say, to when they last saw it. And I think I'm hoping there's a seed that's been planted there as well moving forward. So let's move on to nature credits. And like you said at the top, Ben, change needs to be funded. It can't happen just purely on goodwill alone. We're in an emergency. So would you mind giving us a 101 on nature credits? What does it mean? And if someone hadn't heard that phrase before, could you describe it for us?
I mean, incentives are the most powerful thing in human behavior. Charlie Mungo, Warren Buffett have written extensively about the power of incentives. Show me the incentives and I'll show you the behavior. And I think that the most important consideration before you even get to payments for things like nature credits or nature-based carbon is what are the incentives currently? Because most rich countries in the world provide incentives to do away with nature in the form of farm subsidies. Yeah. So somewhere around $700 billion a year are handed out by world governments, directly or indirectly, for farming the land. And these subsidies generally provide a disincentive to have any nature on your land. Under the European Union's Common Agriculture Policy, farms are spied with an eye in the sky, and where a field is encroached by scrub or flooded with a bit of wetland that's coming back to life, those areas are excluded from the subsidy calculation. So you have to make sure it's drained and flailed and cleared and farmed, no matter how suitable that piece of land is for farming. So for me, the first thing we've got to do is remove perverse incentives to do the wrong thing. Another prime example is fishing the high seas. You simply cannot have an economically viable business model for fishing the high seas. The distances involved, the fuel, the labor, the equipment, it just doesn't work without lavish government subsidies. So why are governments subsidizing an activity like that? Trashing these very delicate, distant ecosystems, and for what? So I think in England, because of course environmental policy and agricultural policy are devolved in the United Kingdom, I think we can be proud of the way we have started to look at those incentives. England is pretty much the first of the world's major economies to do away with unconditional farm subsidies. Following the Brexit vote of 2016, we're no longer in the Common Agriculture Policy. And so we phased out over a 7-year transition period from 2019. So we're coming to the end of that now, basic payment subsidies for farming. But the budget remains more or less as it was. In order to access it, farmers must deliver public goods. In fact, it's said on the face of the Agriculture Act 2020, public money for public good. So in other words, if you're a farmer who wants a continued flow of public money, you have to demonstrate that you're delivering public environmental goods. For example, protecting watercourses or soil or pollinating insects, the kind of natural capital on which all farming ultimately depends. And the more ambitious you are, the more money you get. So if you're in very productive landscapes, the kind of landscapes that produce most of the food, in the UK, 85% of the food that's grown is produced on just 20% of the land, then probably you're going to focus on food and that business, and public money will become less significant for you. But there are still grants for things like using soil sensors and drones to try and reduce your chemical inputs, or experimenting with no-till arable and so on. If you're in remote landscapes that are not agriculturally productive, like the one I'm sitting in right now, you will go quite along the spectrum towards rewilding. if you want to continue to benefit from public money. So scrub-rich wood pasture is the scheme that we're addressing here, with rare breed native cattle, producing a little bit of beef, a little bit of pork, harvesting some wild venison, and the landscape is gently drifting back to a sort of medieval state, and providing some very useful services for society in the process, fixing carbon, holding back and purifying water and releasing it through the catchment slowly during the course of the year. It's a great sponge of a landscape that is now being put back together, and that has significance for millions of people living north, south, east and west of here. So I think that's the first thing that all of this depends upon is trying to get the government out of the way. The government should be incentivizing public goods and not incentivizing public bads. And England is blazing a trail on this. So if we imagine the new environmental land management scheme, as it's known, which replaces the basic payments as a kind of icebreaker ship, well, in its wake are a flotilla of private markets that are growing up to fund particular outcomes from better land management practices. So, for example, integrated flood management. Local authorities and the Environment Agency and private asset owners who are fed up of being flooded, there might be National Grid or Network Rail or Premier Foods logistics hub owners or whatever, are now funding landowners to restore the sponge effect of landscapes in the upper part of the catchment in order to reduce the flash flooding that they're suffering from. At the same time, such activity also holds water in the landscape, so that has benefits for water companies. And those kinds of spongy landscapes and wetlands eat up phosphates and nitrates. So there are markets emerging in things like nutrient neutrality, which is the mitigation of nitrate and phosphate pollution. So landowners up and down the country and also in other countries, Canada, the US, Australia, are now benefiting from payments that incentivize them to manage land for water and for clean water. And so that is an example of a rationalization of land use. Instead of just relying on government subsidy to do something that has no basis in reality, trying to extract a productive crop from 45-degree slopes in the Lake District, for example, the land is being prioritized towards nature recovery and sponginess and water. And you've also got markets now in nature-based carbon. So companies around the world, big technology companies like Microsoft and so on, they want to draw back down from the atmosphere the carbon that they have historically released. So Microsoft have said that they will buy nature-based carbon credits amounting to exactly the amount of tons of carbon that they have put into the atmosphere since they were founded in the 1970s. So whether or not that idea makes any sense to you, it is happening, and billions of dollars are changing hands every year. And the integrity of that market is getting better with every passing year. There have been some negative news stories and some cowboys have been found out and exposed, and bad practices have been described in the pages of the Guardian newspaper and others. And luminaries such as Mark Carney, currently Prime Minister of Canada, previously Governor of the Bank of England, in between he was building initiatives to build integrity and protocols for the emerging nature-based carbon credits market. And it's getting better and better. It feels a bit like solar in the kind of early 2000s when it was a market full of cowboys and the technology didn't work and it was expensive. And it's becoming normal. And it's becoming mainstream, this idea of trading carbon. And in fact, many jurisdictions have regulated carbon markets now where it's not a voluntary activity, it's a regulatory requirement that companies buy carbon credits. The European Emissions Trading Scheme, for example. China has one, New Zealand has one, California has one. And then finally, nature credits or biodiversity credits is another market that has increasing relevance in the UK. There's now a law that requires developers, if they want planning permission for whatever it is, a church parking lot or a new lane on the A36, if they want to build a new housing development, they have to buy biodiversity credits because they have to deliver a net gain in biodiversity from their scheme. And the way you deliver a net gain is by getting someone nearby to do some rewilding. And so there is now a regulated market in biodiversity credits. So the buzzword now in land management is stacking. How do you stack these different revenue streams? You've got income from growing food. If your land is great arable land, you probably stop there. There's income from the state in the form of the new public money for public goods stewardship schemes. There's potentially money from natural flood management or nutrient neutrality that relate to water. There's potential income from voluntary nature-based carbon credits. There's biodiversity credits. And so this is what land managers are now grappling with. And some of the NGOs that we all love, the Wildlife Trust, for example, the National Trust, they're really getting very good at this. The Dorset Wildlife Trust just bought 850 acres at a place called Liscombe, not far from me, and the land was utterly knackered. And now they are restoring this extraordinary scrub-rich, flower-rich wood pasture with native breed cattle And they've paid for the whole land with one very savvy nutrient neutrality deal, which is all about preventing the flow of nitrates and phosphates into Poole Harbour. So these markets are real, and they offer the possibility that we can expand the amount of money available for rewilding and other forms of nature restoration beyond our wildest dreams. And so I think this is quite an exciting time for nature recovery. And I'm not just talking about the UK, this is happening all over the world. I give one other example. Pakistan has done an unimaginably large mangrove restoration. Tens of thousands of hectares of mangroves have been restored around Karachi and the mouth of the Indus River and the Sindh. It's difficult work planting mangroves. It's bloody expensive. Nurseries are needed, and you need people to wade out into the mud at low tide and stick these things in. They need protection, monitoring. It's really hard work and costly work restoring mangroves. Well, the whole restoration has been paid for by global carbon markets. So a group called Pollination, which is a little investment bank, which does just natural capital type deals, managed to raise the money from investors, and the credits are being sold to corporations around the world who want to buy tons of nature-based carbon. So that mangrove restoration wouldn't have happened if it weren't for this market. So it's got to be something that I think we need to grab and strive for.
Okay, we can come back, because I think it's important to probably come back to talk about some of the skeptics and what they might be saying, just to address that. But I'm interested to hear your perspective, Ben. What do you see as the risks to these markets?
So I think the risks on the supply side are that people create projects that don't deliver for nature or for communities. So imagine a corporation that goes to Madagascar and clears some primary forest and drives the local people off the land, does it all very quietly, and then, with much fanfare, a couple of years down the line, plants the land with a monoculture of eucalyptus and tells everyone, look how much carbon my eucalyptus trees are going to sequester. And they start trying to sell those tons of carbon. Well, those are the kinds of projects that have been exposed by some of the negative media articles. So the projects have to be done to a high standard in terms of nature recovery as the priority, and in terms of looking after the local community and making sure they benefit from the project that's happening in their midst. And I think that some of the work done by Mark Carney and also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative are having a positive effect on that side of the equation. And projects are getting better and better. On the demand side, the risk is that companies will see carbon credits as a way to buy their way out of their obligation, a moral obligation, to reduce emissions. And again, that's a topic which has been addressed by several of these initiatives looking at integrity in the carbon market, is to ensure that projects developing carbon credits only sell them to companies that have an externally verified emissions reductions plan. So Microsoft, for example, has a very ambitious plan to reduce its emissions. They're Paris aligned and beyond. In which case, I think it's absolutely fine should they want to say that we're buying carbon credits to offset all of our historic emissions. But if you have an oil company which simply can't decarbonize, looking to buy its way out of any kind of obligation to reduce emissions by buying nature-based carbon, then I think that's more controversial and more difficult. Those concerns that I've outlined are the concerns around this marketplace. I share the concerns of those who do. I think there is a more philosophical argument around valuing nature. George Monbiot has articulated this very well, and I agree with him on some of that. How do you value something that is so beyond price, beyond value? How do you value the song of a cuckoo in spring? Or how do you value anything like that? How do you value the love you feel for your family? And I get that. But if you look at the decision making that takes place in our society, we are valuing nature in every decision. We're valuing it at zero. And I think it's only rational that if nature is helping to prevent flooding, we should recognize the value of that in the same way that we would recognize the value of concrete flood defenses. And often we'll find that nature is the cheapest and the most effective solution in terms of building resilience in the face of such things as flooding or water shortages. And it's certainly the most cost-effective and powerful ally we have in the fight against climate change, because natural ecosystems sequester carbon at an extraordinary rate. So I think some people, particularly on the political left, have a worry about market mechanisms as a solution to big problems. And I understand those concerns, but the fact of the matter is that market mechanisms often are the solution. Look at solar. There's no form of infrastructure that has ever received so much investment in such a short period of time as we've seen going into solar power generation. The scale of the investment in solar is so massive in the world that we are going to be solar powered very, very quickly. And now we're witnessing similar trends in battery installation and in the electrification of transport. Now, if you get it right, the market can fix things incredibly quickly, but there's a big if there.
The phrase that comes to mind is not letting perfect being the enemy of the good as well, and recognizing that context is critical. And we don't do very well with complexity, and media in particular likes to take some of the dominant themes without considering the kind of the niche and the complexity of specific projects. So I think it's really helpful to address those challenges, and then also consider that what we need is money going into nature restoration. So we have to have pathways to facilitate that. I suppose I was thinking about when you were talking about some of these really kind of savvy NGOs that have like drawing down on some of these sources of funding. I was thinking about looking at over our Welsh landscape at the moment, and the average size of a farm in Wales, I think, is about 170 acres. And I think the average age of a farmer is about 60 in Wales. These are kind of approximates. But I think I'm thinking about them. They're probably looking at the farming landscape and thinking, well, maybe this isn't a trajectory that's going to be sustainable for me and my family. But they, where to start with like nature capital, nature credits. Obviously within Wales, we'll have the sustainable farming scheme, but it's probably not going to be, there's a limit to the public funding. So we're going to need to support with some private capital. Where would people go? What would they do to even begin this journey?
The interesting thing about Wales is if you look at the changes that have taken place in Welsh agriculture over, say, 6 or 7 generations, predominantly the Welsh had cattle. They had native Welsh cattle. They had native pigs in small-scale mixed farms that would have been vibrant with life, would have been absolutely heaving with wildlife. In fact, a lot of the species that we've lost from Great Britain clung on for the longest in Wales. The lynx possibly was still in Wales in the late Middle Ages. And then, of course, it was the English who had a colonial mindset who went to Wales and decided that we needed to clear the trees in order to build navy ships, and we needed to force the people off the land in a series of clearances that were very similar to the ones that were carried out in the north of England and worst of all in Scotland and Ireland, in order to establish very large sheep ranches. And so Wales was transformed during that period from a mosaic of woodlands, wetlands and wood pasture with native cattle and pigs and wildlife to one great big massive sheep ranch. So today 88% of Wales is sheep, and that produces about 0.7% of Welsh gross national product and about 1% of Welsh jobs if you're very generous in your interpretation. So it's kind of a madness, and what I struggle with is the idea that the Welsh are clinging to the tool of their own oppression, which was the sheep. So what would it take to change things? Because I don't think sheep are a business that makes any sense whatsoever. No, it represents the production of sheep in the UK, about 1% of all the calories produced by farming in this country. It's not profitable. The average upland sheep farmer in England, I don't know the figure for Wales, but I guess they're similar, has take-home pay, even after taking into account the old basic payment subsidies. This was 2020 numbers, sort of something like £6,000 or £7,000. It must be dire now with the end of basic payments. And that's why the age is creeping ever higher. There's no future in sheep monocultures, and they've been ecologically disastrous. So what I would be doing if I were the Welsh government, wanting to keep people in the landscape. These communities are the backbone and the soul of these landscapes. You want farmers to stay farming in the farms that they've had for generations. So therefore, the Welsh government should be delivering some kind of stewardship scheme whereby there are generous payments on offer to the extent that farmers are delivering public goods. So if you restore kind of upland wood pastures and you switch from sheep to native cattle and you farm in such a way that there is nature recovery in your land, then society will reward you for that. So I think the go-to policy in Wales has to be reform of farm subsidies. And for some reason, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland have not followed England into an environmental land management scheme type approach. So you'd rather be a sheep farmer in the uplands of England now, where you do have these options to switch away from monocultures of sheep towards more gentle, more traditional, more nature-friendly ways of farming, probably with cattle and pigs, not sheep. And in Wales, you don't have such options yet. You've still got the vestiges of basic payments and a rising discontent because no one knows what the future holds. So for me, I think it's all about policy and getting the government to do the right thing in Wales. Beyond that, the risk, of course, is in Wales, particularly from commercial forestry. A lot of these farms are going to hit the wall, and then they end up selling out to some of these large institutional forest plantation owners. And then the hills get blanketed with monocultures of dead zone Sitka or other kind of commercial tree species. And that is the kind of worst of all outcomes, because you have no people, no nature, and just institutionally owned tree plantations. And very cleverly, the anti-rewilding people who have their own motives have managed to conflate monoculture tree plantations with rewilding. And so trees are just trees, whether or not it's a mosaic of semi-open woodland with native cattle or a monoculture dark zone of Sitka. It's one and the same if you read some of the commentary you find in the press. So I think first, for a small farmer with 170 acres, average age 60 in Wales, I'd be looking to the government to provide me with some kind of incentive to manage my land in a more traditional way, in the way that perhaps my great-great-grandfather did. I think carbon is a stretch for a small farm. I think regulated biodiversity credits are England only. There's no such scheme in Wales. So it's much harder for those small farmers. The Welsh government, in being timid and in being slow to change following the Brexit vote, I think has done farmers a tremendous disservice. And I think the national farmers' unions of Scotland and Wales have also done their farmers a huge disservice by not leaning into the direction of travel that is so obviously coming our way, and instead fighting for a status quo that has no future. And the uncertainty is the worst thing for any kind of business, let alone an unprofitable upland sheep farm.
Well, let's hope that the representative from Welsh Government happens across the podcasts and takes this as the inspiration, because I think courage is the right word. And I think that's what we are lacking currently. And fingers crossed that drives it forward. Ben, thank you so much for your time, your eloquence, your intelligence, your passion. It's made for a fascinating interview. And I'm sure all listeners will be wanting to come across Rewilding the World to hear about these reflections on a larger scale. And thank you again.
Thank you so much, Chloe, and thank you, Tom, as well, for inviting me on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both, and I look forward to visiting you in Wales sometime.
I'm just looking back at my notes from this conversation, and a quote I'd highlighted is that Ben suggested that the nature connection and reconnecting young people to nature was one of our most important challenges of our time. I really appreciated him recognising that, and I wasn't expecting that to come through as such a strong theme of our conversation, but it's really helped, again, perhaps give me more impetus in the work we're doing here with the Grange charity. And actually, it was really lovely hearing about his experiences within his family system and how that enhanced his nature connection, because a recent piece of research that one of my MSc students has just completed has shown that of kind of 3 critical factors in nature connection, having a primary figure in your life, whether that's a parent or a kind of close family friend or someone that has that strong attachment to you, help them having that strong relationship with nature and attuning you to it is being absolutely critical in the development of their ecological identity.
Yeah, and I can definitely see that. It's also worth mentioning that he is an extremely busy man, and we really put it down to the bone there. And I would have loved to have another 10 minutes to record with him to really dig further and deeper into that natural capital conversation and just stress test it. Because again, he articulates it so well, but I didn't really get enough time with him to reflect some perspective and challenges back to him, and it would have been nice to have got that. I just feel like that conversation could keep going and going.
He has a kind of infectious optimism about him, where you don't really want to kind of come in with too much of the critique and doom and gloom, which can sometimes exist within when anyone proposes a solution or a new way of tackling a challenge. It's hard for the naysayers not to come in and be like, oh, well, these are going to be all the problems. And there's no doubt there have been many problems with the implementation of both biodiversity net gain and with the environmental land management scheme. We could go into detail about those. It's often to do with perhaps implementation and not intention, you could argue.
Yeah, but I mean, and my biggest fear with it isn't actually what's happened historically. It's going forward. I have limited to low, that's being polite, confidence in government's ability to hold people accountable. So if someone says they're doing something, and they're raising money, and even in the UK, it doesn't have to be abroad, we've got to make sure we have people checking they're doing what they say they're going to do. But that requires money and planning and enough people to manage it and police it. That's my biggest concern with this. I think it's open to abuse. Yeah, I haven't yet heard someone give me a strong enough argument to suggest that this is how we ensure that we hold people accountable doing what they say they're going to do.
I think that's a really fair point you're mentioning, because actually with the biodiversity net gain, in the policy itself, it actually is encouraging more on-site biodiversity retention and enhancement rather than off-site at the moment, which means that currently 90% of development projects have done on-site, which effectively creates that challenge where the developers are not conservationists, they're not wildlife trusts, they don't necessarily know the best way to enhance habitat. They're often working at quite a small scale. And we all know that although it's lovely to have nature as part of where we live, to really promote large-scale nature recovery, we need that to be on a large scale. So we've got a lot of fantastic offers from the wildlife trusts and similar organisations who are offering these off-site BNG credits. But because of the current focus of the policy, it actually means that most of these are happening within small housing developments where they're being led by the developer. And then there's no accountability, as you say, because no one within local authorities got capacity to go back and check whether or not that pond has been put in the right way, whether the wildflower grass is actually taken, whether someone's maintaining the habitat in. And then essentially what's going to happen, you can imagine, is that someone's going to come and be like, oh, that looks a bit messy. I'm just going to trim down that bit to create a bit more grass. You can see the process happening.
Yep.
And then when you look at the implementation of the Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is part of the Environmental Land Management Scheme, essentially got to March and they just closed the scheme. The government effectively ran out of money for that. And the instability that creates for landowners and land managers who are trying to return nature to their landscapes using various different tools to have that just pulled out from under you, that fundamentally undermines your trust in that system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But the intentions are good. We can see the public money for public goods makes sense. You can see that requiring private capital to help return nature has to be part of the solution, because the nature funding gap, from what I understand, is something between 5 and 10 billion is what we need to actually restore nature to the UK. So that's a huge amount of money that's not going to come from public sources alone.
Like everything, it's always easy to poke holes in things. And ultimately, was it your quote that you quoted? Don't let good be the enemy of the...
Don't let perfect be the enemy of the good.
Whatever. But I'm sure there's plenty of listeners that have differing opinions, and I think I welcome everyone's perspective on this, because I don't think there's a right answer. I think it's just going to be the least worst, maybe, going forward, is what it is.
It is, but that doesn't take away, I guess, the opportunity that we have as stakeholders in this process to advocate for what we believe needs to occur within these large policy shifts. It's very easy, isn't it, to sit back and say, oh, that policy hasn't gone far enough, or we're not doing enough for nature in these spaces. But how are you communicating that to the levels of the system that are making those decisions? Have you responded to the consultation expressing that perspective? I mean, there's, I guess, questions we need to ask ourselves.
I think it's worth mentioning at this point that the Grange Project, we don't have any nature credits whatsoever on this project. And I think it's probably worth recapping why, because it's relevant, I suppose, to this conversation. So we are 80 acres here, so clearly not a massive site. We looked at carbon credits, the voluntary carbon market, and some people were talking about potentially £500,000 worth of credits if managed properly from this site. However, there's just so many challenges associated with that. Firstly, it would lock us into managing this site in a certain way for 40 plus years. Because it's a voluntary market, there is no guarantee that the market indeed will even be around in the next 5 years, let alone 10 or 20 or 40 years. And we would then still have to foot the bill ourselves in order to manage all the biodiversity tracking or the carbon tracking to ensure that it's being done properly. So we didn't really feel that carbon credits were the way forward. And then from a biodiversity perspective, the Welsh government manage BNGs differently and have to be all offset on site and not off site. So we couldn't do that. So they're the two options for us on site here. But that's kind of why we're so passionate about demonstrating that you can use sites like this 80-acre farm in Monmouthshire and generate revenue in different ways, in more entrepreneurial ways, more outside the box thinking. You've got to be creative because you can't rely on these big carbon markets to pay the bills. So on that note, I think it could be next episode, we might be in a position to announce some really exciting initiatives coming out of the Grange Project to show, hopefully, the ways in which this land can be used to support itself, to drive local employment, and all done, hopefully, sustainably as well. So that's something to look forward to.
And a small shout out to our cabins, which is one of our income streams to help the nature restoration of the project here, is that we only have about 8 weeks left of the season this year. And I think I would hope that all the guests that have been here have had a really wonderful experience, and the site does look pretty spectacular. Despite being very dry, it is still a very special place to be. And I think a lot of guests have talked about the kind of almost the meditative quality of the space here, and how there's a certain, without getting too woo, kind of energy around the project, which I think helps people with kind of reflecting, making decisions, restoring energy. So hopefully, if that's of interest to you, you can look us up on the website www.grangeproject.co.uk and come and visit us here.
I think you're getting wooer.
I think I am too. I think I'm going to embrace it.
Good. Well, let's do it. Let's see where this woo takes us. Okay. Well, thank you. If you've got this far in the podcast, we really appreciate you taking the time, and hopefully you found it interesting and enlightening as much as we have today with our amazing guest. All right. On to the next episode. Let's go.
Thanks, everyone.